This is The Search for the Sound. I'm Ross Holmes.
My name is Jason Anick.
And today we're joined by our very dear friend, world-renowned violin expert, connoisseur player, and head of the Florian Lettered Shop in New York City, Jonathan Solers.
Hi,
Thanks.
everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to see you again.
Well, it's been a few months with the pandemic and all.
Yeah, last time we saw you was on Ross and I were doing this whirlwind tour where we were just starting this journey of the search for the
Right.
sound, and it was so
We
great to
we
be able to.
we
Yeah,
spent a whole afternoon together just geeking out about violins. It was a lot of fun.
absolutely. And I remember a few incredible old Italians that we got to play on, which that was I'll never forget that.
We have some nice pasta around here, that's for sure.
Al dente all the way.
All the way. Perfect cook.
Love it.
Oh man, well, this is a pleasure to have you. We're so grateful that you're here to talk shop with us, and let's dive in, Jason.
Yeah. So, how long have you been at Florian Leonhardt's, and tell me about like kind of your experience leading up to there and getting
Right.
into that world.
Wow. Okay. So I got into the business in 2005, and it was almost entirely by accident. Um, I remember I was working in retail at that time. And obviously, working in retail is a pretty miserable experience. And I wasn't terribly happy doing it. I was doing a lot of freelancing. I was playing with orchestras, and that was also not quite as fulfilling as I had imagined it would be. And I remember my girlfriend saying to me at the time, you know, I know how much you love violins. Have you ever thought about maybe working in a violin shop? And I was like, whoa, that sounds like a lot of fun, right? So I don't know. I think it wasn't but a week or two later, I was having my bow repaired by Isaac Salco. And um, I mentioned it to him. So, I've been thinking about this thing, maybe working in a shop. And he just kind of paused and he looked at me and he said, you know who you should go talk to? You should go talk to Rene Morel. He just fired his sales guy. What's the worst he could say? No. Now, Rene Morel was kind of a big deal. Everybody who was anybody for the past, 40, 50 years had gone to Rene Morel. All of Dorothy DeLay's students, so Perlman, Zuckerman, Yo-Yo Ma, Sarah Chang, Josh Bell, all of them. Galamian, Gingold, Pablo Casals, like you could go back into all the people that, I listened to growing up playing the violin and worshiping, all the way through conservatory. And they all went to Rene, and he was the architect of their sound. He was famous for his sound post adjustments, and he had a very specific way of doing it. And so all of these people had a certain kind of sound, and that was Rene Morel. So what he was suggesting was flat out terrifying for somebody like me with zero experience selling violins. But the simplicity of Isaac's logic sort of took hold. And I had to work up the courage. I actually went and talked to a few other people first, and at different shops just to sort of feel it out. And I went even I found it easier to go to talk to Michael Selman, who was in charge of beers in New York at the time. And that was less daunting to me than going in and speaking to Rene Morel. But I did eventually do it. And I remember he was wearing his blue smock. Anybody knew it. He always wore the same blue smock. And he was standing behind the counter when I buzzed in. And I just went for it. I just went up to him. I'm Jonathan Solers, and I would like to sell violins for you. And he's, looks at me and with his French accent. Have you ever sold a violin before? No. But I made him a deal, right? I told him, I said, look, you know, you don't have to take me on forever. Like let's do a trial. I'll do 6 months. And if I don't do good numbers for you in 6 months, I'll walk away. Right. And we'll have both tried it. And if it doesn't work out, there were no hard feelings. And that at least got me into the room, and it got us into a conversation. And the next thing I know, I'm in his tryout room. And up until that point in my life, I played one Stradivarius and one Galliano. And that was my experience with great Italian instruments, right? Well, he comes into the room with two Strads and two Guarneri del Gesù and puts them on the table and says, okay, you're going to play these for me, and we're going to talk about them. So I must have been in there 30 minutes before he came back, and I was just like, whoa, you know? And, you know, long story short, I got the job, and he didn't give me the boot after 6 months. We did pretty well. And I was with him for 3 years, and then the shop closed. There was a parting of the ways between him and his partner. And then he went to consult for Tarisio. I think he was considering sort of a semi-retired life, you know, so he would consult with them. So I formed my own consultancy, and I would advise musicians and collectors and institutions and things of that nature. And I did that for a few years. And then right about, wasn't maybe but a year or two later, I remember I was at 250 West 54th. With that time in New York, everybody, you know, who was in the business was at 250 West 54th. So I was in the building for whatever reason, I can't remember. I think actually I may have been working on my violin that day with Stefan Balcho. And this very handsome man, you know, with this quad case on his back, comes out of the elevator and into Tarisio. And you know, we're talking, and I introduce myself, and this is Florian Leonhard, and he leaves me with this card, and he invites me to this party that he's having. He's opening a shop in New York, you know, and he invited me to come and be at the opening party. So I did. I went, and I'm glad I did, because we had a nice conversation there. And the people that he opened the shop with in New York, it didn't last but maybe a month. It was the whole relationship with them went bad very fast. And so he was without, you know, a New York person. And I mean, anybody who knew the New York scene at the time knew that New York was really ripe for the picking. So Florian was smart to identify that. 2 months later, my phone rings, and it's a, you know, +44. It's a UK number. You know, who is this? I pick it up, and it's Florian Leonhard. We started a conversation, and we talked. We talked for like 2 hours on that one call about violins and you know, people in New York and everything. And I was really impressed, obviously, by him. He was very sharp. Very savvy, and then I could tell also there was like a generosity to him, you know. And so we started working together, you know. He would send me instruments, I would sell them. When I needed, you know, a certificate from a great expert, I would ask him, and he would provide, you know, me with certificates. And we did this for a while. About 4 years like this. And then by year 4, we were selling, you know, really nice violins together. There was a Stradivarius, and there was a loop phone, there was a Fresenda, and you know, it was several $1 million we'd done. And, you know, his team in London starts talking to me about, you know, Florian coming back and having a shop in New York City. And well, we sort of merged our two enterprises into one, and here I am, you know, helping Florian, you know, run his New York shop, and we're business partners, and very lucky in that regard. you know, to have somebody like Florian Leonhard on our side over here. So we're happy because here in New York really needed a great expert, so that you could provide some stability to the market. You know, I think when people spend a lot of money on something, the most important thing is that they're getting what they paid for. And for me, I was only in the business, I think, a short time. You know, I didn't have the eye, and I would still not be somebody that would sign a certificate, right? It takes years and tens of thousands of instruments to the point where you just look at something and you know, because you've seen it 1,000 times before in different forms, and you just know what it is. I'm not there yet, but I knew that if I wanted to be the best possible person for my customers, I needed that behind me. And so having Florian as that rock, you know, with which we could anchor our business, it's been tremendous. And we've had wonderful success here. We've made wonderful friends, reconnected with old ones. And despite the pandemic, we're here, we're surviving. And we're trying to help support the community musicians too that are going through it as well. So that's a very long and drawn out story, but we covered about like 15 years of my career there. So, you know, we got into it, and then Florian, and so here we are.
Yeah, thank you. I love it.
Well, you know, one of the things that's interesting about the story of your career in particular is that not only did you go the way of studying these instruments and these makers, but you're also a player as well. And as we've talked about, that's very rare to be a shop proprietor and to also be a very skilled player, because there's that natural relationship between shop owner and pedigreed instrument, but the deeper relationship between shop owner who knows the history and can also play and relate to the sonics. So I guess as an expert who knows the makers and the provenance and the value of these instruments, when a player walks in the shop and says, I'm looking for this type of tone, is there a base that you go from to help direct them in a way? How does that process look like? What does that mean?
You know, I used to think this was something that was easily verbalized. And I should have known better from my own experience as a player, because if somebody were to have asked me, what do you want to sound like? I want to sound like the greatest violinist alive. You know, what is that? So I think over the years, I think that morphed, because you see, sound is its own place in the brain, right? And we know it as musicians, like it lives there, right? And what's very difficult is to then sort of put that into the language part of our brain and convey it. There's too many steps there, and you're going through too many filters. And what often comes out of the mouth isn't what the ears really want to hear. And sometimes, truthfully, people don't really know what they need in their life until they have it, you know? And it's like that with so many other things in life. But sometimes you just pick up a violin and you're like, wow, I can't let this go. So what I try to do instead, and this is where being a player who does this job comes in really handy, is we try to be very, very selective of the instruments that we take in. So not only do we have the normal filters that I think a top dealership, you know, would go through the process of vetting an instrument. Is, you know, all original? Is it clean? Is it, you know, the condition good? Is it healthy? Is this going to fall apart on the customer? Is this going to be a problem? This and that. And it's got to, you know, sort of, that really narrows the field right there. Is this something that we could put our brand on and back up, you know, for years to come? So that's the normal shop filter. And then there's the filter, well, does it sound good? Does it play well? Is this something that we can sell? And so what Katie and I try to do is when we take in instruments here, we really play them through. And that's one of the filters that they go through. And you could have the most beautiful example of a violin by a phenomenally famous, maker. And if it sounds like a box, then we have to evaluate whether that's something that can be corrected. Was there some prior setup, with the instrument being bridge or sound post or bass bar? Was there something there that isn't working? That's to say, if the architecture of the violin is good and healthy and correct, then you have to look at why it's not working. Or is it simply just something that architecturally isn't going to work? And, that's something, we would pass on. And so, we like to think it's more quality over quantity, so that when we do have a customer come in and visit a particular budget, they don't have to verbalize what it is they're seeking. We'll put 5 violins on the table. They will all be really, really good. And they'll be sounding their best, because that's another thing, being a player, that Katie and I are constantly doing. Is the violin ready to be shown, right? You get one shot at a first impression. It's like a first date. You get one shot at it. So you want to make sure that that violin is dressed and, it's got his hair nice, really impress them. And, then the players sort of take it from there. I advise them, to sort of start with the ones that they know they don't like, weed those out, work it down to 2 or 3 that you do, and then see if there's a connection there. And that has been a surprisingly effective method, really. And in this way, they don't have to sort of do that analog thing of trying to vocalize what they want. Anyway, that never really works. This way, they hear and they use their own ears, and they decide whether that's what's in them, and what is that their voice? Is that how they imagine themselves?
Absolutely. I love that. I have 2 things I'm super curious about. You mentioned setup, and
Right.
Rene Morel having kind of a legendary way that he set up the post, and everyone, all the top soloists would get their setup there. Yeah, and so I'd love to just the first thing would be just a little bit on how important setup is to the sound and the potential and bringing out the best of an instrument.
Mm-hmm.
As well as the other thing I would be curious about is if there is I know a lot of the top soloists head to your shop, and if there's a story of somebody that one of the top soloists who comes in that you think just like maybe is one of the biggest violin nerds and could just talk for hours about this kind of stuff, and
Yes.
just,
Yes. Multi-layered question. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about setup, because you did bring up Rene. And what's interesting is it's been now 10 years since his passing. And, the world has already moved away and evolved from Rene's concept of sound. And, Florian, for his part, came up in the Hill workshop. He was a youngster and wanted to be a violin maker, and being he was an extremely ambitious person, wanted to work for the greatest violin house in the entire history of violin, and that was the Hills, and he did. And he became their shop foreman, head of restoration. And that was before he then went and worked, with Machhold and Bremen, and really developed his own concept of setup and sound. And I would say that our shop follows that model, that Hill model, that concept that he developed there, where it's much freer. There's less pressure and tension on the instrument, and the instrument is allowed to breathe more. And so the results actually have been really successful. Anybody who's listened to, Maxime Vangerov or, Leonhard Kavakos knows that this works. So where that post is in relationship to the bridge, that design of the bridge, its architecture, all of this is extremely important in how those vibrations are transmitted throughout the instrument and eventually heard by us. So enough can't be said about this, because you could have, a bad bridge, you could have a bad post, you could have, a bass bar inside that isn't working, and you have an absolutely perfect violin otherwise, and you just know it has to be that. So then your question, when you'll have to forgive me, it went into trying to recall.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I was kind of
your question was about soloists.
Yeah, somebody
who love to geek out.
Yeah.
Oh, 100% Leonhard. Leonhard owns every book that we would have on our shelves, and he goes to bed at night reading these books. So it's really a daunting thing to sit down with Leonhard. If you've ever met him, if you've ever seen him play, if you've ever seen him in a master class, you know that Leonhard's attention to detail is wow. I mean, he will take a score apart and understand a piece and be able to convey it in ways that are nothing short of perfect. The thing is that brain he possesses is also just as equally capable at looking at a bow and telling me what it is, or looking at a violin and telling me what it is. If he wasn't the greatest violin soloist in the world, he would be a violin expert. So I got to really be on my P's and Q's and know my stuff around him, because he's sharp as a tack on this stuff. He loves it. He loves it as much as we do, which is, it's really fun when you have a customer that shares that passion, and we'll sit there and just watch you work, and we'll just play the violins, and you learn as much from them as anything else. I mean, Leonhard is wow. Yeah. He definitely, I think, as far as, that takes the cake. We have plenty, by the way, of customers that love to dig into this stuff and read the books and understand the makers. And usually it's targeted. So if I own a Scarompella, for example, I will have bought Eric Blode's book and I've read it, and I know a lot about this particular maker because this is something I'm interested in because I own it. We'll see that. And then 80% of musicians are just like, here's my hammer, where's my nail? And it's and of those, you have to constantly be reminding them, come in, let's get it clean, let's check the seams. You're saying it should be louder. I agree, it should be louder. You probably have 10 seams open. When was the last time you updated your insurance appraisal? And yes, you have to sort of be there to remind your customers, so that you can continue to provide them with the best service, but also that the instruments that they use as their voice, as their tool, is 100% in perfect condition to do everything they need for it to do. It's like taking your car to the dealership. You have to do it. You have to change the oil. You have to change the wiper blades. You got to check the brakes and the tires. And you probably get away with not doing that for a while, but then things will start to happen. And well, we're here to always be observant of that.
One of the things that you just spoke about that I find really interesting, and I want to touch on briefly, is that as fiddle players, first and foremost, of course, Jason and I are lucky musicians in that we've been exposed to classical music, and write classical music and have dabbled in that world, but it's a safe bet to say that in the jazz world and Americana world, we're fiddle players, and we have specific ideas of sound that we're going after. I know, speaking for myself, one of the first violinists whose tone I was intrinsically drawn to because it borderlined on that dark fiddle tone versus bright classical tone was Kavakos. Little did I know, I made a trip to Chicago a while back and was presented with the Stradivari to play, which was the Earl of Falmouth Stradivari. I didn't realize that that was the fiddle that I had first heard him play on his recordings of Yesai.
Right.
But there was something when I laid the bow on the strings and played, I'm like, wow, this is a Strad. It's a long form Strad. I didn't know an instrument like this could be a fiddle, a dark, just mysterious sounding instrument.
Yeah.
We have to go to the fact that these prominent soloists around the world, whether you're a classical violinist or a fiddle player who's playing a cigar box with strings, we all know about Stradivari. We all know the tip of the pyramid. But what we don't know is the range and breadth and depth of his making from the early years to the later years, which is what Kavakos has spanned in the instruments that he's from 1680s, 90s through the early golden period to now in the 30s.
I think the Falmouth is 93. He went from the Falmouth to the 1724 Abergavenny, and now from the Abergavenny to the 1734 Willamette. So he's gone from, you're right, long pattern to, you know, this post-golden period, which is a darker sound for sure, to this 34, which is certainly, I think, of Strad's work, the darkest. They have the most heavy execution because, I mean, he was in his 90s and his sight was failing him. It was still beautiful work, obviously, but, you know, the executions were heavier. The result, obviously, was this, you know, powerful, dark sound that really, really works well with Leonhard. You know, I heard him on social media today. He's in Dallas, believe it or not, this weekend, and he's doing the Beethoven concerto. And I contemplated putting Katie and the kids in the car and driving because, you know, starting last year, when I heard last year that he was going to be doing Beethoven with the New York Phil, it was supposed to be this April, so coming up in a few months. And when you know, pandemic hit, you know, I was crushed. I've truly waited my entire adult life to see the Beethoven concerto live. That's, I'm sure, crazy to imagine. I go to a lot of concerts, but that's the one concerto that I wouldn't go and just see anyone play. That was the one concerto I was saving, and I was saving it for Leonhard. And my soul was crushed when this pandemic hit, and I knew that concert was going to be canceled. And like I said, I contemplated putting everybody in the car and going to Dallas and seeing, you know, Fabio Luisi conduct, you know, Leonhard, and, you know, Alex Carr's concertmaster. I mean, Dallas is a great band, great orchestra. You know, we have some friends in that orchestra. And a killer some of our violins are in that orchestra. I would judge, but I think Katie talked me out of it. She said, well, maybe if it was a little closer than Texas, we would do it. But this is crazy.
Well, you got to go right through Nashville to get there. So if you just want to stop off the road,
listen, I was serious. I was dead serious this morning. I was like, how long is it? Is it like 22 hours, something like that, if we split it up? And she's like, are you crazy? Like, we're not, we have a 6-month-old, 22 hours in the car. Are you nuts? You know, we aren't going to fly because of pandemic and, you know, so on and so forth. So I got to sit this one out. Leonhard, I will hear your Beethoven. I swear to God, everybody better get their shots because I'm not going to miss it. It's going to happen.
You were talking about, the long form Stradivari
Yeah.
from 1690s to the post golden period to the late period. When Stradivari started, as I understand it, he was a cabinet maker. Is that right? He was.
Well, there are many schools of thoughts here. There's many schools of thought. You have your traditionalists that adhere still to what the Hills thought in 1900, and that is he was an Amati pupil. But then you have the people that observe the fact that, well, his work is missing that dorsal pin that every Amati alumnus used. And you see a visual similarity between his work and Francesco Ruggeri. Could he have potentially studied with Francesco Ruggeri as opposed to Niccolo Amati? We don't know the answer to that. There is also, as you mentioned, this school of thought that says, well, he's clearly a trained woodworker. He has experience with inlay, because his skill with inlay is these purflings are phenomenal. So we're not sure is the answer. Where his training came from. Because, if he had the skill and talent, and clearly he did, he could have taken those violins that he was seeing around Cremona and emulated that. But it's hard for me to imagine that he would have been right out the gate making, beautiful violins as perfectly as he was making them early on, without that. So I personally, I actually haven't talked about this with Florian. I'd be curious to know what his thinking is. I personally am of the school of thought that there's too much similarity between his work and Francesco Ruggeri that I feel there must be a connection there. Ruggeri, of course, was a pupil of Amati. So there we could see a connection and why the Hills may have thought that, right? Because there is a visual similarity in that work. But to me, I think he must have studied with Francesco Ruggeri. And Francesco Ruggeri was godfather to, I think, Amati's kids. So, there was a closeness there. But, I have an early Stradivarius here. We've been holding it on behalf of the owner. And this is probably one of the earliest ones I've seen. This one dates to the year 1670. And this is only really, 4 years into his career. His first earliest labeled instruments are 1666, or circa 1666. So we see something that more closely resembles some of the other stuff in town. These delicate Fs and this arching is much closer to Ruggeri than it is to what we would later know to be a Stradivarius, right? There's this sort of simplicity and masculinity that develops over time with him. The corners get shorter, the Fs get a little bit more open and more robust, and he simplifies the things that were beautiful and elegant about Amati's work or even Ruggeri's work, and creates something. And he was an innovator. He was a true genius, obviously. I mean, there was nothing wrong with the Amati design, right? I mean, they'd been doing it already at that point about 150 years, or at least 100 years by the time he started. And kings and queens and everybody was buying them. So there was, clearly there was no problem with Amati's design. But in his mind, there was a direction that he wanted to go with it. And when Amati passed away in 1684, I think he was free at that point to do what he wished with to evolve the design of the violin. And, that 80s period is considered as perfect craftsman period where everything is very, very, very perfect and lovely and elegant. And he starts experimenting with the long pattern. The lengths, perhaps, he got from Brescian instruments, which are generally bigger and more robust, but keeping, the slim waist. And so that still would have that creamy sweetness. They were a powerful instrument. Anybody who's heard, you know, like Leonhard's earliest recordings on the Falmouth, as you mentioned, or, you know, Gil Shaham plays on, or did play on a long pattern, Countess Polignac. And that, I mean, trust me when I say nobody would ever hear, you know, have a trouble hearing him in the hall. So there was, but that was like something he messed around with for 8 years, 9 years. And then comes the early golden period. And right about 1704, he gets this log of maple that was just the most beautiful thing God ever created. And that source of maple that he had created the Betts. It created, you know, the Marie Hall. It created the Viati. It created about 10 years plus worth of instruments.
One tree?
One tree. Wow. And they are all gorgeous. The flame is amazing. And what he did with it was amazing. At this point, he was in his 60s, you know, he was maturing. He had a clear vision at this point. Now he had kids to help him. And his production was starting to really hit its stride. And in about 1720, that wood, you know, runs out. And we see this sort of more simple, more local. There's some opio that we see, more slab backs. Still nice stuff. I mean, the Abergavenny still has a beautiful back. And other instruments, Sleeping Beauty and others I've seen, also very nice, but not that same wow flame. You know, the Messiah, Lady Blunt, just wow flame. And then, yeah, the 1720s into the 1730s, failing eyesight, more involvement of the kids until he passes away in 1737. And that last violin is still very much his hand. Like, I think that says a lot about the kind of person Antonio Stradivarius was. He must have been an absolute nightmare as a father. I genuinely mean that. Think about it. When you look at this man's work, what you see is perfection. There's a reason that Stradivari violins are the most beautiful violins ever created.
There's that original head on the fiddle? That's original?
Yeah, this everything on this is original. And this man was an obsessive perfectionist. And we know that he was tough on his kids when they decided not to work for him. There's a famous story about Paolo Stradivari, who started, you know, working with his dad and then decided he hated it and went off to be a merchant in Venice. And when he did that, Antonio wrote him out of his will. You're out, kid, you know, good luck to you. Except Paolo turned out to be a successful merchant in Venice, made a lot of money, and Daddy was very happy and wrote him back into the will at that point. But, you know, Francesco and Alma Bono were not so lucky. They were pretty much, it's interesting. But up until that point in Cremona, you know, the kids would learn from the dad, right? And they would apprentice and they would eventually have careers of their own. Except their dad lived to the age of 94. I don't know how many times he dodged the bubonic plague, you know, to make it there. And so they never really got that chance to have their own careers. And it's a question really of whether they wanted it. Because by the time Antonio died, Francesco was, I believe, 77 years old. And he pretty much unchained himself from Daddy's bench and never made another violin after that. Alma Bono, too. I think maybe Alma Bono made one or two violins after that. Obviously, they inherited a lot of wealth from their father. There were still unfinished instruments. They sold the house and its contents, remaining contents, to the Bergonzi family. Carlo Bergonzi moves in to Casa Stradivari, inherits a lot of unfinished work. That's why we see some Carlo Bergonzi instruments that, you know, have the outline of a Stradivarius. There's one violin I know that I swear to God started its life as a G-form Strad and ended its life as a Carlo Bergonzi. And there's the one Carlo Bergonzi cello that I know. I think it might be Michelangelo. I think it's Michelangelo's son. Michelangelo Bergonzi cello 100% a piccolo B model, like the Florian cello, and there it is, a Michelangelo Bergonzi. So yeah, he must have been a nightmare. That's all I'm going to say about that. I don't think he wanted to be one of Stradivari's kids.
Oh man, so you always hear of people are like, oh, I must have, I want to find an attic Stradivari, you know, or
Yeah.
you know, that never happens. But you know, tell us about this violin that actually came into your shop recently that turned out to be kind of an interesting story.
That. Okay, so we could take a little bit of a walk if everybody would like. We could go visit the workshop and I could show you guys.
Yeah.
So let's head over that way. This is a funny story. So the setup is this guy, he's an amateur player. He does it for pleasure, and he's pretty good at it. And he goes to like estate and tax auctions, and he buys, whole lots of instruments. I did get past the keypad lock. Everybody, this is the workshop. This is where the magic happens. This is the doctor's office, the surgeons for your fiddles. This is where they go to get fixed. Anyway, so he buys these lots of instruments, and he sends me this picture. It's a Sunday. So, I always love it when my customers reach out to me after hours on the weekend. That's always great. But he sends me this really interesting photograph of this violin. And he said, I was going through these cases. I've probably had this, under my bed for like 6 years. It looks nice. What do you think it is? And so, just by the photos, it has a Stradivari label, which is it's a nice looking label. So, but it's not a real one. And I'm thinking, gee, this violin, kind of looks like a Violin. And he brings it in on Monday. And I was so heartbroken because, well, I have it right here, actually. I'm going to switch the camera around so everybody can see. I was so upset because we opened it up and there was this, I have to get it at the right angle. There's this spurious Violin signature. I don't suppose you can see that there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that is not Violin's signature. No. And it should be up in here, and it should be in pencil, and in the center should be the last 2 digits of the year. So I'm looking at that, and I'm like, oh no, that's not Violin. That's not Violin's signature. So I'm thinking the guy, doesn't have a Violin, and I have to rethink maybe what it is. Here's the top. Jimin, who is our head of restoration, head of workshop, is doing a year-long restoration on it. We popped the top off of it, and sure enough, inside is this teensy tiny stamp that Violin would put on the inside top, just adjacent to the bass bar. And my heart was like so happy to see that, because that was often not faked. Like you could fake the signature and all that, but that stamp, that was not something that was often faked. So I was really happy for him, because I think he'd spent $50 on that and 6 other instruments. He nearly sold the whole lot of them to a mariachi band just to get them out from under the bed. Glad he didn't, because we're going to invest, as I said, about a year, and he's going to invest about $40,000, $50,000 of his money into this restoration job that's going to turn his $50 into a $300,000 violin. So that's a pretty cool story. So that doesn't happen every day. I field a call a day from somebody that has a Stradivari in the attic, and every time, I think my heart wants it to be true for them. It has happened. Of course, these become like legends and tales that are told between shops. There's the famous story, of the guy that walked into Charles Beer's shop. I think it was sometime in the 80s, and he had just bought a violin from a guy on the street for 50 pounds, you know, and took it in, and sure enough, it was a Stradivarius. And it wasn't hot, it wasn't stolen, he had just bought it cheap. And, you know, stuff like that becomes legend. And so you want that for people, but that call a day invariably turns out to be, you know, some late 19th, early 20th century mass-produced instrument, you know, that it doesn't even look like a Strad and doesn't even have a convincing label, but you know, the guy on the other end of the phone is telling me I'm wrong, and it's cool. He can tell me I'm wrong, and God bless him for it. Anyhow, that's the workshop.
Let me ask you, Jonathan, you know, we're talking about Stradivari violins a minute ago, and they're worth millions of dollars. And you just showed us a Violin that a guy bought for $50 that after its, you know, $40,000 to $50,000 investment of restoration, making it immaculate again, the instrument will be worth about $300. Why for
no 300,000 bucks?
Excuse me, $300,000.
Big difference.
I said big difference.
Little different.
But for a lot of viewers out there, these numbers are staggering.
Yeah.
But yet it makes sense. Can you explain a little bit about the nature of the value of these instruments, pedigree, sonic value, all of these factors that really do play into the intrinsic value of these playable pieces of art?
Yeah, I used to think it didn't make any sense to me, because I think when you're a musician, the only thing any of us care about is sound, right? I want to sound good. So I want the best instrument that I can afford that sounds good. And I think the most important thing I had to let go of coming from that world into this world was that sound and money were somehow connected. That if I spend $10 million on a violin, that I will sound, you know, 10 million times better than if I spend $10,000 on a violin. And I would say overall, this is somewhat true, but I have heard $1 million violins sound better than a $10 million violin. I have heard, you know, a $400,000 violin sound better than $1 million violin. So there are exceptions, and I think you come to find there are patterns, and there are certain makers that, you know, were extremely successful with their design and their concept and their model, and when they're well set up, work really, really well. And so, yeah, we are talking about these numbers are crazy. I come from rural Ohio. My father was a school teacher. These numbers are insane. They still remain insane to me. But to some people they aren't. And if I can help them, you know, get into something like this, you know, you know, like a Violin or something, today I could sell it to them at $300,000, and you know, 8 years from now it's $600,000, and they're going to be really happy with that, you know. But where does that come from? I mean, it's just simply they're objects of art. Okay, the maker is long dead, and the market took over assessing what that work is worth, right? There are two, I sort of like to divide living makers and their market from, you know, non-living makers. And this is very much a free market concept, right? When the maker is alive, they tell you what their work is worth. And sometimes you get some involvement of the free market. We see that, right, with Sam Zygmuntowicz, for example, when, you know, Isaac Stern's violin sold and it went for over $100,000, and Sam was like, yes, I can up my prices, you know. But oftentimes it's not the case. You know, living makers, you have a tool, you don't know whether that value is going to go up or not. Whereas we have over 300 years of data on these old Italian instruments, and we can tell you precisely what sort of rate of return one might expect. It still should not be the primary concern when you're buying a violin, especially if you're a player. But I think it's an important one, because if you're going to invest that kind of money into something, personally speaking, if it were my money, I would want it to be well protected, right? I want to see that do something for me, because someday I'm going to want to retire. And maybe I can sell my violin and be okay. You know, I can use it. It can be my career fiddle. And then, you know, when it's time to exit stage left, sell it, go live in Florida and have a great time. You know, whatever it is that people do when they retire, I don't know. But yeah, I still think it's crazy. You know, I remember when I first started, you know, selling 15, now almost 16 years ago, you know, I could buy a Sartori violin bow for 12,500, maybe 15,000 for one in great condition, you know, silver mounted, of course. Today, that same bow is $45,000. That's not inflation. Work that out. That's something like 10, 11% per year. That's real money. You know, that's better than the stock market. That's better than gold. That's better than wine. And that's better than some fine art. So that's why I think the violin, you know, violin market has attracted this sort of classical music loving, uber wealthy person that, you know, sees it as this alternative investment vehicle. Okay. And I'm glad for that, because I lament the fact that I think, you know, we are living right now in the last days where a musician themselves will purchase and own their own Stradivari. I mean, we go back in time to the 19th century, you know, we see these soloists, Joachim, Viotti, these guys owned, I don't know, 10 Strads, you know, over the course of their career. Paganini had a whole collection of Strads, violins, cellos. He had a crazy collection of stuff. They could do that back then. And now the prices have gone, you know, so high and through the ceiling that it's not realistic. You want a very fine golden period Strad these days, it's 15 to 20 million, could be even more. Doubtful, slightly less, unless there's something going wrong. So, like, that's really, really crazy. So, you know, if we do have, you know, these uber wealthy, classical music loving people that really appreciate Strads or appreciate Guarneri of Jesu, and will, you know, invest their money into them and still give that over so that it can do what it's meant to do, so that we can go to the concerts and still have that hair stand up on the back of our necks when we hear something. Because there really is nothing like hearing a great violinist with a great violin do what it is they do best. When you have that, it's magic. And I really don't want to lose that as these prices continue to climb. And so, you know, it's a question of when all these makers become inaccessible. You know, Guadagnini's, I started out my career selling Guadagnini's at $455,000, and now that same violin's $1 million, $1.3 million, maybe $1.5 million. You know, the better Guadagnini's are now, you know, at or passing $3 million. It's staggering. I mean, musicians don't make that much money. Even the great violinists, you know, Yo-Yo Ma or whatever, they make good money. They don't make that kind of money. That's crazy money. And what I really don't want to see happen, as I said before, is for us to lose the ability to go to Carnegie Hall or go to, you know, wherever, and hear these instruments. If we're not able to do that, I think we're at a terrible loss in our culture and our society. So let's hope that they don't go hiding into some vault. That has happened already, where we have, sold Guarneri del Jesus, to, this fabulously wealthy person, and that violin lives in a safe somewhere. And this is criminal to me. I understand the concept behind it, of course. You've put $15 million into something. You want to, see a return on your investment, so you want to preserve it. That's fine. Our luthiers here and in London can absolutely make sure that violin gets played every single day, 8 hours a day, and still be in that condition when it's time for you to liquidate. And when they go into that vault and they disappear, it's criminal to me. It's just the saddest thing. It's not what they were meant for. And I think if we could go back in time, even Stradivari would think it's ridiculous. I mean, he was the best marketer, I think, of anybody at the time. There was a saying promoted, be as wealthy as Stradivari. He knew what he was doing. He's selling to kings, counts, the aristocracy of Europe. So he was getting his money. But I think, even he would want to hear them.
Well, it's great that you are advocating for getting them in hands of great solos. I remember when we were at your shop, you were saying that you kind of help pair them up often, like which soloists that are looking or
Yeah.
Yes, you can help.
I mean, it's not really much of a secret. You see, the market for violins at that level is teensy tiny. At any given moment in the world, I'm talking the entire planet Earth, there might be 20 Stradivari violins for sale, of which our company probably controls a third of those. So, obviously, when it's time for people like that to explore their options and explore that, they'll have a sponsor behind them and they'll want to, find that sound. Invariably, they'll pass through our doors here or in London, and they'll see what we have. And that's a really humbling thing. You'll be sitting there at Carnegie Hall and you'll be listening to the person up there on stage, and they'll be playing on a bow, you sold them, or maybe an instrument that you sold them, and you had a hand in that. Everybody around, no clue, and that's fine by me. I had my moment on the stage. I enjoyed it. I love performing, but that's not what this is. That's not what I'm about. And so, it's a bit like being the Wizard of Oz, right? You're behind the curtain, and people don't see what you're doing necessarily, and they don't understand maybe all that sort of goes into it from our side, the preparation, making sure the instrument is perfect, in the care that we put into that, and making sure that person is, ready to, take that Ferrari out for a spin. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that people don't realize. Even musicians, I find myself sometimes even having to coach professional musicians. Sadly, this is not something that they cover in conservatory. I didn't know what a sound post adjustment was until I met Rene Morel. I'd been playing violin 20 years at that point in my life, and I'd never heard of a sound post adjustment. I didn't know my violin could sound better than it did. I thought all those problems were my fault, and I was just a crappy player, and, maybe there was something wrong with me. And that's why, actually, we like to take these on road shows. So we'll visit music festivals, we'll go to competitions, and we try to engage musicians where they're at this really sort of important phase in their life, this sort of late high school, early conservatory point in their life, because I think it's a soul-crushing thing to go into a practice room every day and beat yourself up and think that you're the problem and it's really the equipment. And and that's when I'm out there and we're going to these places and we'll put 20 violins on the table and you can have a Strad and you can try a Dolgese, you can try a Prasenda, you can try a Violin, and all this stuff, and even down into, 100,000, range, for a Biziak or something. But I want them to have that experience because I want them to know what sound could be like for them. I want them to have that in their ear because when I was 14 years old, I played my first Stradivarius. It was the 1703 Lady Harmsworth. And at the time it was owned by a guy who had a violin shop in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I walked up to him. He had a booth. It was all state orchestra, and he had a booth at the thing for a shop, and there was his Strad under the glass, and everybody, was playing all the other violins. And I said to him, "Can I play that one?" He says, "Are you any good?" I said, "If I wasn't, I wouldn't ask to play it, would I?" 14. So I think he was impressed that this kid was cocky enough to say that. He gave it to me, and it was like, whoa, like my whole universe just shifted. Like everything I thought was true just went out the window in that moment when I drew those first strokes. And I was like, what is this? This is madness. Like the sound that was coming out of that violin wasn't even something I could have conceived of 5 minutes ago. So for us to be able to go around and do that and me to, to be able to give other people that experience, I think is really important because I want players to constantly be thinking about that. I want them to be thinking about, well, my violin sounded great a week ago. Now it's not sounding great now. And why is that? And that's what we're here for, right? We're that pit crew, when they bring that Ferrari race car in, we're here to make sure it's like, wow, that's our job. And that's what, when we put people together with their instruments, I want everybody to be driving a Ferrari. I don't care if it costs $100,000. I don't care if it costs $1 million, but I want them to drive out of here in a Ferrari. That's for sure.
You touched on something that's really interesting because, you look at the top and you're looking at Stradivari and Guarneri and the Amatis and these instruments that are known around the world, these makers. But then there are the lesser makers, the more unfamiliar makers to the general public, even to most players. Guadagnini, a lot of players know Guadagnini, but you mentioned Biziak. I'm a humongous Biziak fan, but very few players know Leandro Biziak and his family, the Biziak family. You're talking about 1% of the value of a Strad, but yet tone that's amazing. Yeah. And there are other instruments, contemporaries of Strad. You've got Bergonzi, who we talked about earlier, and even Stradivari's sons, Omobono. But then you have Del Jesu, and then you have the makers that followed Stradivari's patterns, and Del Jesu's patterns, and the idea of this, which leads us to contemporary making and modern instruments, and the truth that there are so many new instruments that if you put them against the old instruments in a blind test, sound just as well, very close to just as amazing as instruments that have existed for 400 years.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys remember, but a few years ago there was the Paris test.
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
You remember the Paris test?
Yep.
Totally.
We got ourselves into a situation there with the Paris test where we couldn't win because we had several Strads in there, but the new violin that won was also ours. So we could have gone bragging about how our violin beat the Strad, except that we're over here also trying to sell the Strad.
Right.
So we were obviously very proud of that fact. And, since then our the work that comes out of our new making workshop, it's really outstanding work. I mean, some of the makers, the new makers that have come through, and trained with Florian, and combined this, our new making workshop is really cool in that these guys are sitting right next to the restorers. So they're seeing Strads, they're seeing Bois, they're seeing Guarneris, they're seeing the real thing. They get to hold it, touch it, and experience it, and know that violin and know that maker, because there it is. It's right there in front of them. They can spend time with it, you know, and they can copy it. When we create we call them true copies. We call them true copies because they're made in the presence of the original. And this is a privilege, honestly, that we have as a company, being that we are who we are, that we can have a Strad for a period of time, that our new making team can make, you know, 2 or 3 versions of it. Our output is very low. Florian's a perfectionist, oversees every step of the development. So we produce maybe 6 instruments a year. They're amazing. They're a little more expensive than some, but I have one here. In fact, this one is a little bit older. This one, I believe, was made when Philip Eli was head of workshop under Florian, head of new making under Florian. And this is a copy of the Ole Bull, Guarneri del Jesu. This violin, the original, sits in the museum in the Shimei Museum in Taiwan. And Florian got to spend a little bit of time with it in London when it was out for the exhibition. I think that was in 2010, 2011, right about then. And our team got to spend some time with it, and they were able to produce a couple of really phenomenal and convincing copies of the original. Now, most new makers are working off of 2-dimensional static images. They get the Strad posters. On the back are the graduations, the measurements, and that's the world they work off of. I've seen that work really well. I've seen it not work. I think a lot of making is intuitive. Like you are a sculptor of wood, right? You're creating this wooden sculpture that is also, you know, an acoustic experiment. And so there's a lot of different artistic and scientific disciplines that have to sort of really gel to create a great violin. And we live in a wonderful time right now, I think, for that, because as we talked about prices of these old Italians going, you know, through the ceiling, we have this wonderful body of work that's being produced now of new making, where musicians can purchase something that sounds phenomenal for a fraction of the cost. You know, for you know, $60,000, somebody could own one of our copies that, you know, we will put on the table with Strads and Guarneris to make the point. And there's something to be said about that. Now, you can't really compare the two. As I said, you know, a new violin, when the maker is alive, is an investment in an object that you're going to utilize as a tool. And who knows what the market will do someday when Florian Leonhard is no longer on this earth. They may go through the ceiling. They may be like Violins, you know, like Violin produced thousands of violins, and how many people in his workshop helped him make them, Christ knows. But he oversaw every stage of the development. And those are, you know, those are some of the best performing as far as return on your investment out there, you know, in that price segment. I mean, I started out selling Violins in 2005 for $175,000. The same violin today is, you know, $375,000, $400,000. Not bad if you own one. Terrible if you're trying to buy one now, right? Wish you could kind of get in the time machine, go back then, you know, pick them up for a few bucks. But that just makes the argument for the new violins, doesn't it? Because here you are, you know, this is a great sound, right? And this is, you could win a job with that.
Oh, well, it's been amazing chatting with you, getting your perspective. Yeah, we can't thank you enough for your time and perspective and history lesson. And, you know, that's a big part of this series is hearing from all the perspectives, players,
Yeah.
and as
It's a
well as
different world on this side of the table, you know, but it's all very important stuff. It all
absolutely,
has to gel.
absolutely.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun talking with you guys about this stuff.
One
Let's
final
do it
question.
again.
This will be
Yeah.
super short, but what is your
Oh,
favorite fiddle? What's your favorite violin that you've ever seen or played?
Ooh.
Of all of them, it could be anything.
wow. Wow. Okay, so what's my favorite? That's interesting because I've been blessed to handle some pretty amazing violins, like pinch me stuff. I spent some time with the Lady Blunt. Obviously, that was really spectacular. I mean, because there's the original bass bar in its own little case, you know, and that's wow. You see Stradivari's concept there unmessed with. That was pretty neat. But what is my favorite? Oh, that's an interesting question. Hmm. You know what? Actually, I'm going to answer it this way. I would have to say my first love of a Stradivari, right, was the 1720 Woolhouse. This was a violin we had for sale at Morel's it was in the room, you know, when I was hired, and of course, you know, I was holding the fiddle that Daniel Hope plays now. That's Lipinski del Gesù. But that Strad I kept in my office because at that point I hadn't given up my playing career really, and I was still practicing every day. And so I would keep my chops warm at work, right? And I kept that violin in my office, and that was, I think, for me, you know, my first love. Stradivari. Is it the best condition? No. Is it the best preserved? No. I think that award goes to Lady Blunt. But I think just because I connected with that particular violin at that particular time in my life when I was transitioning from that world into this, I think that violin still today remains really meaningful to me. And if anybody out there knows who owns the Woolhouse Strad now, please let me know. I'd love to see that violin again. Very special violin to me.
Oh, that's awesome. What a great, what a great fiddle to just have around in your office.
I know. Listen, it still wasn't quite, you know, it's never something that's normal, right? And not to me at least. This is so far from normal, but this is my everyday, and it's crazy and it's pinch me. I mean, my kids probably have no concept. I mean, I know my daughter doesn't. You know, like I'll have, you know, a Stradivari cello, maybe what, I don't know, 30 of those in the whole world. You know, I mean, not that many. And you know, she'd be like, "Oh, that's neat." What do you mean? Like, whoa, let's slow the train down here. You know, you clearly have been exposed to this as a normal thing, you know, too much, and yeah, it'll never get old to me. That's just bottom line. It will never get old to me.
Oh, I love that the passion remains, and I love that you really appreciate like the opportunity that you have to be able to spend time with these instruments, match make, these instruments,
Guardians.
and
We're
guardians, yeah,
guardians, right? We're the ones passing through their lives.
yep,
So our responsibility as players, as dealers, is to see them through to the next generation, that they arrive there unscathed, so that, you know, hundreds of years from now, we can still be hearing these Stradivari's as healthy as they are today.
Well, the work that you're doing as an expert, as an accessible resource to musicians is invaluable. And of course, we're so grateful for your time. And beyond just having this conversation, the fact that you welcomed us fiddle players into the shop to spend time on these beautifully historic instruments, but also the fact that you welcomed us in as peers, as musicians, it speaks to the larger essence of what it means to be a part of the string community, to be a part of the music community. And you're absolutely right. We're caretakers of the instruments. We're guardians of the instruments. We're caretakers of the music. We're guardians of the music, and we're all creators in contributing to the story of not only the music, but the instruments themselves that tell the story, which tell the story from our hearts. And it's an amazing relationship. And this time with you tonight has been revelatory. Just the down home personal experience and connection is it's meaningful. And
it's really easy to idolize the violins themselves, but we realize that they were made by people just like us, right?
Yeah.
And you get to know the violins, you get to know their work, you get to know the people. And whether they were fiddle makers or fiddle players, art and music and the confluence of these things has always really fascinated me. So it's fun for me to engage with guys like you and talk about this stuff, and I'm glad for the opportunity to do it. So thanks for having me. And I hope we get to do it again soon.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be back at the shop, and yeah, to be continued.
To be continued.
Next time we're back, we're having a jam session. You're going to bring a bunch of cats from New York City, and we're going to throw down on some tunes. We're going to get in there. Stradivari instruments aren't going to know what hit them.
Game on.
Game on.
I love it. I love it.
Jonathan, thank you so much. This has been an absolute privilege.
Thanks for having me, you guys. I've had a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. Well, until next time. Yeah, be well.
Thank you very much. Have a great night.